excited to have you on because this is a very interesting time, especially for us in New York. There has been a bunch of revelations about how deep Chinese influence operations have gotten in our humble little state. Uh, and you're an expert on this. So why don't you give us an idea of like what are the CCP's influence operations? Are they just like what every country does? Is there something unique about them?
First of all, I think it's important to start with the idea that the United Front operations of the CCP are an integral part of the Chinese Communist Party's foreign policy. It's essentially an arm of their foreign policy. It's a formalized, set up operation, not only to propagandize for the party, but also to find, for better use of the word, useful idiots, right? Who they can cultivate and who can serve as mouthpieces for them. That's something called elite capture. It's known as in China as a magic weapon, one of the magic weapons of the party. And there's a New Zealand scholar, Anne-Marie Brady, who has written at length about this. Peter Mattis is somebody else who I'd commend to your audience if you want to get more in depth. But essentially, these operations are global. They involve gray zone operations. So this isn't really spy v spy as we were used to in the Soviet days. These are things that are sometimes perfectly legal in our democracy. For instance, friendship organizations between cities, the the idea of business chambers or sponsored trips to China. When I was at the State Department, we uncovered a program that former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had signed off on that was essentially a partnership with the United Front organizations in China that sent congressional staffers and their spouses to China on the Chinese dime, essentially to go eat noodles in Shanghai and be propagandized. And when we got rid of it, of course, Congress erupted. They were very upset. They really liked the free trips. So you can see, right, how attractive some of these programs are. And last thing I'll say, when I say that they're global, I really mean that they're global. These operations first really came to light in a meaningful way when Miss Brady in New Zealand started writing about them years ago, and then Australia uncovered many of them. But China's a big country, and it's a totalitarian regime. They got a lot of people to throw at this stuff, so you can be fairly confident that this isn't just happening in New York City, where there's a large Chinese American population, or LA in Orange County, where there are also large Chinese and Taiwanese American populations. It's happening in small towns across America, all the way down to the PTA level, where the party is trying to identify future political leaders, future business leaders, people of influence who they can cultivate to speak on behalf of the party.
Yeah, I think that's what's really scary about this. The whole thing got a lot more attention in the U.S. I feel when the discovery of the secret Chinese police stations came to life, because that was such, especially after the spy balloon thing, that was such an aggressive thing. But yeah, what people don't realize is, like as you say, even on the PTA level, they're scoping out all levels of society to find, as you say, these useful idiots in the hopes that someday they will be in a position where they can be very useful to the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, on the police stations, let's talk very briefly about that, because it's not illegal for someone, working in a United Front capacity to approach, say, someone living in Flushing, Queens, and say, you know what, you really need to go home to China. Now, what is illegal if they threaten them and they say, if you don't do this, I'm going to inflict bodily harm on you or your family back in the mainland. So you better get on the airplane. But if the individual willingly gets on the airplane, doesn't report it, what are U.S. authorities supposed to do? Very little, right? A law hasn't been broken necessarily. So that's just one circumstance, just to demonstrate how difficult it is, not just to teach the American public, CEOs, boards of directors, trustees of universities, not just to teach them that this is happening, but then secondarily to encourage those who are impacted to come out and talk, and then to report it to the authorities. And again, that's just one branch of United Front operations. The more meaningful stuff, it's not really spying; it's more like softening us up to accept Chinese policy and to kind of tilt the scales on the side of Beijing.
Can you think of what do you think is the most significant case of this that's come out recently?
Well, take the Chinese student associations on college campuses. There was an incident a couple of years ago. I mean, I could cite multiple examples of it. When the Dalai Lama came many years ago to California, the consulate ginned up protests, people to get out in the streets. More recently, when President Biden met General Secretary Xi in California, we now know, thanks to some really excellent reporting, I believe it was out of the Washington Post, that again, you had hired thugs to come out and rough up pro democracy protesters. And that's happening on our soil. This is what's so infuriating about it, is that we know it's happening, and yet we continue to allow it. And we don't have to do that. Remember a couple of years ago, during the Trump years, when I was at state, my boss, Secretary Pompeo, shut down the Chinese consulate in Houston because of the activities that they were engaging in. Now, that wasn't just United Front, that was also some various other nefarious things that they were doing. But it demonstrates that we don't have to take this, there can be consequences for it. So, those are just a couple of examples. There was an example, for instance, of the harassment of the family of a candidate that was running for Congress in Long Island. And the sad part about it is, you have to wonder if this were happening in, I don't know, the middle of Miami, or L.A., would it get more attention? I mean, these are outrageous things. I remember many years ago, I took a trip to Midland, Texas, to meet a gentleman who helps people of religious faith in China, and he's, harassed all the time. I said, "Why are you living in Midland?" He said, "Well, then I can see the MSS officers coming from a mile away because it's really flat in Midland, Texas, and there's nobody else around here that looks like them." So,
Smart.
the Chinese community is extremely sensitive to these threats. They get what's going on. It's just our business leaders, our politicians, that need to be educated about it.
So, what really can be done about this? Because, as you say, some of these things are not necessarily even illegal. We, especially nowadays, live in a very race conscious society, and the CCP is more than happy to call any kind of action against the United Front to be, anti-Asian discrimination. So, what can the U.S. actually do about this? Like, what would you educate these business leaders about? Like, it can't be just like, hey, watch out for the Chinese.
Well, during our administration, we made a massive effort to publicize just the facts, because this isn't a partisan issue, shouldn't be. Every American should be concerned about efforts to influence us, whether it's our view of the party or influence our elections, or, as you say, interfere in our social media to stir up discontent and social tension, which we also know that they do. But the secretary made a series of speeches, one to the National Governors Association, which was the first time that a major cabinet official ever talked about these influence operations. Interesting, it was the Secretary of State and not the FBI chief, although he started talking about it after Secretary Pompeo came out and talked about it. He did a speech to state legislators in Wisconsin, talking about efforts to cultivate on the state level. And then he went to Georgia Tech, and he talked about influence operations on college campuses, efforts to really impede free speech there. And that's a really important area for, I think, these education uh, efforts to happen, because not only do you have Chinese Americans who want to speak out and exercise their free speech rights, but you also have Chinese students that are coming over from the mainland, who want to learn the truth about things like, say, Tiananmen Square. And I was friendly with a former professor at Harvard. She taught a class on Tiananmen. She said students would come up to her and say, "I really want to take your class, but you can't put my name anywhere. I have to audit it. I have to stand in the back. Nobody can photograph me or video me." And they were terrified. And they're terrified in the middle of Massachusetts. I mean, it's outrageous. So what do? You have to raise the alarm. You have to educate. You have to make clear this isn't anything directed against the Chinese people or our wonderful Chinese American community. And then you take logical action. You stop the US government from partnering with the United Front. You make very clear that's not going to happen anymore across all of the agencies. You go to business chambers, like, say, the US Chamber of Commerce to start, and you have these CEOs sit down and listen and educate them on what's going on. And then you go to the press corps, which is a fundamental part of our democratic process, and you say, why aren't you guys investigating this stuff? You hold hearings in Congress. I mean, there's a number of things that we can do. We can enact consequences on the Chinese government for this stuff going on. I mean, maybe we should have closed the consulate in San Francisco. The ugly truth of it is that the U.S. State Department doesn't want to do that, because if they do it, they're going to get a consulate in Guangzhou shut down or the consulate in Hong Kong shut down. To which I'd say, who cares? It's not like your diplomats can roam around mainland China or Hong Kong without being closely surveilled, followed, and harassed. So are they really doing that job? No, they're not. So I think we need to be more forward leaning in our foreign policy, recognize what this is, and then take a series of actions to contain it and ultimately eliminate it.